Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Calvin Coolidge, and the focus is continuing the Harding agenda. The year is 1923, and Coolidge and his wife Grace are spending the summer in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, at his father's farm there, doing odd jobs around the farm, basically taking it easy, when all of a sudden things changed. On August the 2nd, with a knock at the door in the middle of the night, President Warren Harding had died. Harding had been on an extended trip to the West Coast. He was the first president to go to the Alaska Territory. At the end of that portion of the trip, he got sick. Got back to Seattle, Washington. Doctors looked at him and said, look, you need complete rest. Sent him on a train directly to San Francisco, canceled all the events. He checked into the Palace Hotel. Within a few days, though, he didn't recover. In fact, he died. And now there was a rush on the night of August 2nd to get to Plymouth Notch, this remote community, this little tiny hamlet in Vermont. And William Crawford, a reporter, was among the first to get there, knocks on the door, and John Coolidge, Coolidge's father, answers. He gets the news, goes upstairs and tells his son he's about to become president of the United States. Well, Coolidge dresses formally. He and Grace go downstairs. They're trying to figure out what to do. They want to contact the outside world, but this is a very primitive part of the country in terms of no electricity in the home, no telephone yet. And so they actually strung a special line, a telephone line, into the home so the vice president could communicate with the outside world. Gets a hold of Harding's Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, a former justice on the Supreme Court, and he's asking his advice. Well, who can swear me in? Because he's saying, look, you should take the oath of office kind of as quickly as possible. And Hughes says, look, I know there's no federal judge around there. How about a notary public? That actually should be fine. Well, there was one of those right there in the room because Coolidge's father, John Coolidge, was a notary. So in front of only 9 people in this tiny parlor in John Coolidge's farm, by the light of the kerosene lamp, a father inaugurates his son with the oath of office to become president of the United States, the only time in American history that a relative had performed that duty. After that, well, Coolidge did a couple of things. He sent a telegram of condolence from him and Grace to Mrs. Harding. He also made a notice to send out to the American people. Reports have reached me, which I fear are correct, that President Harding is gone. The world has lost a great and good man. I mourn his loss. He was my chief and my friend. It will be my purpose to carry out the policies which he has begun for the service of the American people and for meeting their responsibilities wherever they may arise. After that, Calvin Coolidge went back to bed. He only slept for a couple of hours, though. He was up early, he met with the press, started really formulating his thoughts on his new lot in life. And he actually wrote later, it is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know that he is not a great man. When a man begins to feel that he is the only one who can lead in this republic, he is guilty of treason to the spirit of our institutions. Now, many presidents actually felt quite differently from that, but this is the perspective of Calvin Coolidge. He also actually thought, despite all the things that were about to fall upon him, he was actually prepared. He later told an artist by the name of Charles Hopkinson, I thought I could swing it. Well, with that, it was time to head to Washington, D.C. after a brief stop at the local cemetery where Coolidge went and visited his mother's grave. They then got to Ludlow, Vermont, where they were able to get on the train, head to Washington, D.C. Coolidge's first responsibilities, well, it was the Harding body had to arrive in Washington. It was taken to the White House. There was a ceremony there, a ceremony at the Capitol. Then everybody went to Marion, Ohio for the burial. Coolidge's, of course, went along for that as well. He told Florence Harding, take as long as you want to move out of the White House. He and Grace would stay at the New Willard Hotel as long as they had to. First time he sat at the executive desk of the president was August the 13th. First time he moved into the White House, August the 21st. The initial goal for Coolidge, no change. He told his cabinet members, like Harry New, the Postmaster General, to continue right along in the same old way. They also told the White House staff, again, they didn't want a lot of changes. One of the carryovers from the Harding years was to retain the Secret Service agent, the head of the detail, Edmund Starling. And Starling and Coolidge actually got to be quite close. They would take walks together every morning, oftentimes in the afternoons as well. And we get a lot of the intimate insights of the Coolidge presidency, of which there aren't very many. Some of the ones that we do get, though, are from Starling and his firsthand account that he related in his own memoirs after he served a total of 5 presidents. Another thing that didn't change was trying to be the relationship with the press. Now, Warren Harding had been a newspaper man, and he believed in a very close relationship with the press, which work out very well for him. Coolidge also believed in transparency. Now, at the time, presidents were not quoted directly, but Coolidge believed this was a good tradition to continue with. He would have over 500 press conferences in his tenure as president of the United States, more than anybody else to date, which is a lot of talking for a man who, as we know, didn't really like to talk very much. Personality-wise, very different from Warren Harding, and some of that stuff changed almost immediately. Coolidge made it known he was not going to have lots of the cronies that Harding had around. They were not going to be coming into the White House. There were not going to be late-night poker parties going on. No alcohol was going to be served, as now that Prohibition was in effect. Alice Longworth, the oldest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, very much of a socialite in town, she later wrote that the atmosphere was as different as a New England front parlor is from a back room in a speakeasy, comparing the Coolidge White House to the Warren Harding White House. Coolidge, of course, was going to be a very business-like president, but he did have, from a social standpoint, one real asset, and that was his wife, Grace Coolidge, the new First Lady. He actually preferred the title Mistress of the White House. She was charming, she was sociable, she was outgoing. Everybody in Washington, D.C. actually took to her quite a bit, especially in comparison to her more taciturn husband. When it came to social events, she was the star, but Coolidge, of course, was all about the job, all about the business, and he was going to carry forward with many of the things that Harding had started during his administration. The cabinet all agreed to stay, and initially the focus was really going to be with the Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, and also with the Budget Director, General Herbert Lord. Lord had been the head of Army Finance during World War I, and now he was running the Budget Office for the President, and he was very much aligned with Coolidge on budgets and cutting. According to Coolidge, he said that the budget idea, I may admit, is a sort of obsession with me. I regard a good budget as amongst the noblest monuments of virtue. He did that in his personal life. He was now going to try to do it for the entire country. In fact, it was pretty clear what he was going to do with that budget. He was going to cut spending. He believed the government needed to spend less, perhaps get more money into the hands of the American people through tax cuts and reduced spending. Coolidge said to the Congress when he met with them for his first annual message that for 7 years the people have borne with uncomplaining courage the tremendous burden of national and local taxation. These must be reduced. The taxes in the nation must be reduced now as much as prudence will permit, and expenditures must be reduced accordingly. Of all services which the Congress can render to the country, I have no hesitation in declaring this one to be the most paramount. He and Lord then oversaw the next meeting of the semi-annual meetings across government in terms of the budget, and Coolidge said in very simple terms, "As for me, I am for economy." What did that mean? Economy in government spending meant cuts. And that's what he and Lord were about to go do. Now, while this was all going on, there were some distractions for President Coolidge hanging over from the Harding administration. Congress had launched some investigations into charges of malfeasance on a couple of different areas during the Harding days, and this brought out actually some sensational testimony. We covered this in a previous episode of Presidential Chronicles under Harding and Teapot Dome. I'm not going to repeat that here. Needless to say, Coolidge tried to stay mostly away from this as this was going on at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. But one thing that was close to home, there were a lot of accusations to his now Attorney General, Harry Doherty. And folks were saying that Coolidge should can Doherty, including powerful senator from Idaho, William Borah, who basically told Coolidge he should fire Doherty. Well, the response from Coolidge was, look, I'm here as a Republican president. Doherty was Harding's friend. He stands high with the Republican organization. I do not see well how I can do it. For now, Doherty would stay as the Attorney General. In December, he had one other decision to make. Look, the Republican nominations process for President of the United States for 1924 was right around the corner. People wanted to know, was Coolidge going to run? And he said almost immediately after he gave his annual message that yes, if the Republicans would nominate him for president on his own, he would accept that nomination. But mostly his focus was on the economic policies, again, carrying forward a lot of the ideas from Harding and trying to, again, advance them here in a Coolidge administration, starting with tax cuts. Secretary Mellon believed in steep cuts, what he called scientific taxation, which is not that different from what others have called supply side or trickle-down economics. The idea was lower the top rates on the people who are paying the most taxes. The wealthy would would then have that extra cash in their pocket. They would invest in new products and services on behalf of the American people, who would then have jobs, and they would actually be able to buy more things, and revenue for the government by lowering taxes would actually go up. And his principle of this was found in the regular economy. When railroads, for example, cut prices, so many more people could travel, revenues went up. When Henry Ford cut prices on the Model T, his automobile, again, individual prices went down, but so many more people could buy, revenue for the country went up. So Coolidge and Mellon were advocating cutting the top marginal rate, which were way up during World War I, from 58% down to 31%, so a big cut. Nick Longworth was the majority leader in the House of Representatives, and he was kind of on point to run for this legislation in the House. This was not going to be easy. Yes, the Republicans had a majority in the House, but the Democrats were against these moves, as were many progressive Republicans. They actually wanted to spend the surplus on other things. There was a projected about $300 million surplus that year, and a lot of folks in Congress wanted to spend it on popular notions, like a bonus bill for veterans of World War I, direct aid to farmers, the one part of the economy that was really still struggling, while much of the rest of the economy doing well, farmers not doing so well. Well, Coolidge completely opposed this approach. He says it was not wise, it was not appropriate, special interest giveaway. Well, Congress passed the bonus bill. Coolidge vetoed it. They passed it again. He vetoed it again, but this time they overrode. And this was actually going to be an immediate challenge because he and Budget Director Lord were trying to get the budget under $3 billion. It was $5 billion just a couple of years ago. Coolidge had brought it down. They wanted to get it under $3 billion, but this bill alone added $132 million. It was going to make their job tough. They would still try to cut. In the meantime, the hearings were continuing on the Harding administration and some of the malfeasance there. This was really heating up. The pressure on Harry Doherty was quite significant. In fact, where he was called to testify and provide documentation to Congress, and he refused. And at this point, Coolidge said, enough's enough. He thought that Doherty was now conflicted, he was not cooperating with Congress. He did ask for Doherty's resignation. Doherty balked a bit, but eventually he gave in. Who did Coolidge go for as the Attorney General? Well, someone he had known all the way back in college by the name of Harlan Stone, who is now serving as the Dean of Columbia's Law School. Harlan Stone would be the new Attorney General. Now, the legislation for tax finally passed in 1924, and it was a disappointment. The top rate came down, but only to 46%, not nearly what Coolidge and Mellon had wanted. Plus, Congress increased the estate tax to 40%. They made an interesting provision. Individual tax returns would now be available to the public, and that had certainly never happened before. What does Coolidge do? Did he veto? Well, no. He eventually decided to sign it, better than nothing. He said a correction of its defects may be left to the next session of Congress. I trust a bill less political and more economic may be passed at that time. To that end, I shall bend all my energies. Of course, that's if he's reelected as president. Some other bills on the table. There was an immigration bill, again, trying to protect American workers by curtailing the amount of immigration. Coolidge was generally in favor of this policy, but there was an element of the bill that would specifically exclude immigration from Japan, and Coolidge had a problem with this. This had been an issue since back in the Roosevelt administration around 1907. This had kind of heated up when the Japanese finally agreed that they would self-curtail immigration to the United States, but didn't want kind of a ban on the books, just sort of to save face. It was called the Gentleman's Agreement. Well, Congress now said no more Gentleman's Agreement. We're going to actually exclude Japanese immigrants under this bill. Coolidge didn't like that piece. He said so publicly, but again, he decided to sign the bill. Civil rights during this era, well, there wasn't a lot going on. Now, Harding had actually put forward an anti-lynching bill at the federal level. States were sort of managing this horrible practice of lynching. The Ku Klux Klan was actually on the rise in the 1920s. Lynchings were on the rise. And in some cases, without a federal law, they were sort of going unprotected in parts of the country. And Harding had put forward an anti-lynching bill. It never went anywhere. Coolidge brought it back. In fact, he brought it back every year that he gave his annual message. It never passed, but he kept it on the table. The sad thing is, other presidents would keep it on the table for 100 years. The first federal anti-lynching bill wasn't signed into law until Joe Biden signed an anti-lynching legislation into law in 2022, basically 100 years after Coolidge and Harding had been in the White House. But Coolidge did pursue civil rights in a different area. He spoke at the graduation at Howard University, a primary black college in Washington, D.C., in the summer of 1924. And he said to the students there, "Those of you who are fortunate enough to equip yourselves for these tasks have a special responsibility to make the best use of great opportunities. Racial hostility, ancient tradition, and social prejudice are not to be eliminated immediately or easily, but they will be lessened as the colored people, by their own efforts and under their own leaders, shall prove worthy of the fullest measure of opportunity." Education had a lot to do with that, and Coolidge went to bat. He actually lobbied to create a $500,000 fund, much of which from Congress, to be able to support medical school education at Howard University. Congress appropriated $365,000 for this effort. In fact, the fund was oversubscribed thanks to private donations. The following year, Congress came in with some more money for a new building for Howard University. So look, there wasn't a lot done in this post-Reconstruction Jim Crow era in the name of civil rights, but Coolidge, at least on the education front, did put his money where his mouth was, even if his anti-lynching legislation really didn't go anywhere. Republican convention for the nomination for President of the United States in 1924 was one of the most efficient ever on record, which is good for a very efficient man like Calvin Coolidge. It lasted just 3 days. Coolidge was nominated on the first ballot. The vice presidential nomination, that had a little bit of a twist because Frank Lowden, the Illinois governor, actually got the nomination. He declined when he was contacted at his home, said, "I don't want to take that on." So they had to reopen the vice presidential roll call vote. It eventually went to Charles Dawes, who was a former banker, quite wealthy. He was also a public servant, served in prior administrations, very much aligned with Coolidge on budget cuts. So it would be Coolidge and Dawes running for the Republicans. For the Democrats, it was almost a complete mess, the opposite of the Republican convention. Their convention took 16 days, one of the longest ever, 103 ballots to pick a presidential nominee. And they finally went with a dark horse, a compromise candidate, John Davis out of West Virginia. For the vice president, Nebraska Governor Charles Bryan was nominated. He was the younger brother of former standard bearer William Jennings Bryan, but the Democrats were hardly aligned coming out of their convention in New York. For Calvin Coolidge, he was basically ignoring all of this because he had a much more personal thing going on. In fact, it was a tragedy developing in the White House. The Coolidge sons, John and Calvin Coolidge Jr., had come home from the Mercersburg Academy for the summer. John was about to go to Amherst for college as he had just graduated, and he and his brother played tennis a lot on the White House courts. And one day on June the 30th, they're playing doubles with a couple of White House physicians. And Calvin Coolidge Jr. played in sneakers but without wearing socks. A couple days later, he is not feeling well. He's running a fever. A doctor looks at him and finds a blister on one of his toes. But he finds more than that. There were red streaks running up the leg of Calvin Coolidge Jr., and the concern was maybe some kind of infection caused by that blister. Well, they eventually took, after doing some tests, they found out it was an infection, a staph infection, and it was growing. And Calvin Coolidge Jr. was then taken to Walter Reed Medical Center for additional observation. More doctors were brought in, but he was getting worse and not better. Within a week, he was gone. Calvin Coolidge said, "When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. The ways of providence are often beyond our understanding. I do not know why such a price was exacted for occupying the White House." Calvin Coolidge Jr. was only 16 years old when he passed away. The Coolidges went to Plymouth Notch, where Calvin Coolidge Jr. was buried next to Coolidge's mother and his sister, who had died in his youth. The couple, Grace and Calvin Coolidge, distraught, went into deep mourning. They weren't about to campaign, weren't focused on the presidency. Charles Dawes, the vice presidential candidate, was doing plenty of campaigning during the campaign. Every once in a while, Coolidge would issue some sort of statement like this one when he said, "Perhaps in no peacetime period have there been more remarkable and constructive accomplishments than since March 1921. So certainly very proud of the Harding-Coolidge presidency, of what they were able to accomplish. It ended up being a landslide over Davis and another candidate, a progressive candidate, Robert La Follette, was also in the mix, ran as a third party. Look, the economy was humming, unemployment was down, wages were up. This was a landslide in the Electoral College for Coolidge and Dawes, 382 to 136. La Follette also got one state for 13 votes. 15.7 million people voted for Calvin Coolidge, just shy of Warren Harding's record in the popular vote. That theme of keep cool, keep Coolidge, that certainly resonated. He was going to get 4 more years in the White House, or a full 4 years in the White House, ready to do his job, but with a very heavy heart after losing his son just a couple of months before. That's Calvin Coolidge, and continuing the Harding agenda from the life of Calvin Coolidge. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.